Hare Krishna, and welcome to class 4 of the Nectar of Devotion. We're going to be looking at chapters 4 and 5, I believe. Yes, chapters 4 and 5. And so our hostess with the mostess is a little under the weather. So she's going to be tuning in from a different room, which means I will lead a kirtan and then we'll go into it as usual. And we got a little bit of a smaller group in person and pretty good crew online, but we're all connected through transcendental sound. Hare Krishna. So, without further ado, musicians of audio, have a little kirtan. Best way to start. Start with a little invocation, glorifying our spiritual teachers. Allow for the transmission of spiritual knowledge. So take a deep breath in through the nose, out through the mouth. Releasing any tension, grounding, establishing our ears and heart in a receptive mode to call out. Deep breath in. Om Jnanatimirantasya Jnananjana Shlakaya Chakshurunmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Vanchakalpatrupyascha Kripasantupya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Vasadi Gaura Bhaktivinoda. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Everybody. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare. Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare, Hare Krishna Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare, Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare, Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama 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 Hare Hare, Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare, Hare Rama Rama Hare Hare, Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Hare, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Everybody, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Everybody again. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Shri Nectar Devotion ki jai. Okay. Om Ajnanatirantasya Jnananjana Shalakaya Chakshurmilitam Yena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha. Vanchakalpatarupyascha kripasantubhya eva cha patitanam pavanebhyo vaishnavebhyo namo namaha. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Srivasadi Gaura Bhakta Vrinda. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna. All right, great to be with all of you. We have Drew here in person for I think the first time. That's great. Great to have you. And just confirming, give me a thumbs up that you can, like, when you hear Drew and Amy talk, say something.
Say something.
Yeah, can you hear them? Yes, awesome. So we fixed that. Technology. Technology is our servant, not our master. Very good. Good. So picking up where we left off, we had really nice discussion last week and throughout, on the WhatsApp. A lot of nice reflections. Let's I'll just start us off some things that I heard that I thought were really beautiful, and I'd love to hear anyone pick up the thread from any of those things or anything else that stood out from the reading, the discussion, or the class. We heard about how the bhakti seed is actually planted by devotees. That if one is practicing bhakti, it's to be understood they've practiced before. And the root cause, ultimately, of bhakti is just that causeless mercy, that ingress of mercy that a devotee just gives. And so there's that importance of devotees. And there was a nice, one of the persons in the group, maybe I think it might have been Allison, was talking about, so how does that even work? How is it that it happened at this time? Why at this time in this way? Like, what is Krishna's logic? What a beautiful and kind of inscrutable thing that is, that Krishna's perfect timing in that, And we also heard about, how one's qualification for bhakti is to be beyond the bodily platform. I read a nice reflection. Someone wrote about how that's a gradual thing to realize we're not the body. Like, we can kind of intellectually grasp that, right? But to actually truly feel the truth of that I'm actually, I'm not this bodily existence. I'm not these designations. I have a true existence beyond them. That's a deep thing that comes bit by bit. And that's actually the foundation for pure devotional service, because devotional service is not a material thing. It's not conducted according to our bodily designations and, culture, or, age, sex, and all those things. We're going to get more into that this week, actually, in the discussion. Chapter 5 especially, we'll talk about that. We also had a nice discussion on WhatsApp about material happiness versus, spiritual happiness versus really the highest form of spiritual happiness, devotional happiness, which is the relational spiritual happiness, not just the joy of being an eternal living entity beyond the body, but actually from that platform then connecting and relating to the Supreme Person. So let's hear any reflections from anything I just said or you heard from last week that stood out to get us going before we jump into chapter 4.
I'll reflect.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So I just have kind of been looking, I've been sensing this theme, which I absolutely love. And like it kind of even dovetails off of our last classes with, oh my gosh, I just spaced on the name of the book we read on nature.
Later to the
Lily
Bhagavad.
Yes. And so like we can take all these inspirations from the natural order of things. And so, throughout, when I finally got to actually read the text, first Prabhupada talks a little bit about like a child walking and
Mm,
how like, it's not artificial. Like when the child's learning, it's intrinsic in them. It's a natural thing for a child to walk. And with practice, the child walks very nicely. And then continuing through that theme, he talks about human society, that the movement is intended to set the whole of human society in their proper condition. Again, like reflecting back that this is like the natural state of everything. And then kind of advancing it one more time in chapter 3, he talks about how like everybody's competing against each other in like the material world. And we all want to be like,
mm.
be greater than everybody else, but you can dovetail that greatness into wanting being, that extension to the unlimited, to the greatest of all, the Supreme Lord. So yeah, that's happening in material world, but can we then take that and extend that to the Supreme Lord? So I thought it was just really beautiful, again, how he's taking us through things that we can relate to and we see in every day, and kind of bring that, and how do we like then relate that to our spiritual existence. So that was the one thing I thought was really cool. And then the second thing, and I shared this with Kishori as I was leaving, is that like the thought process of like there's nothing like special about us. And I'm not saying that in like a in a way that's just like saying I'm no good, but there's just really nothing special. And the fact that I think the majority of us were introduced to Krishna consciousness by the mercy of a devotee, which was Kishori, is just absolutely like mind blowing to me, and how thankful and grateful I am, not only to have been introduced, but then have that seed nurtured and now be part of this community she's developed. So my like just my gratitude for Kishori in doing this is just like exemplified by hearing back to say like, yeah, it's the mercy of a devotee. That's it. It's not that you did anything special. You could be the family of a dog eater, or you could be a prostitute, you could be whatever. And like by the mercy of a devotee, this is brought to you, and like you get to do this. And so it's just really humbling, and then also like empowering to say like we've been gifted this, and so whatever we can do to bring this to whomever, there's no qualification for who we talk about it with, is just so amazing.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you. There's going to be more on that this week that, it's not like in the world of karma, you pay a price and you get something from the marketplace, and you feel you've earned that thing, you are owed that thing because you paid the price for it. It's very transactional, you know, and that's where pride and all that can come up. It's like you can afford it because you have the money. You could, whether it's money or some other currency, like I'm attractive enough, I'm this enough, I'm that enough, I have good enough birth, I have good enough qualifications. So give me, right? Or I don't, and I want to get that so I can get the thing. And bhakti is not in that world. It's not transactional. The capacity for love between the soul and the supreme soul is not transactional. It's a free exchange, which means that it's freely offered, regardless of our material distinctions, and it exists regardless of those material things, which are coming and going anyway. And the other point you're saying, that Srila Prabhupada was talking about, just like a child can naturally begin to walk. Every marathon runner or sprinter couldn't walk at some point, 100% of them without exception, but they all did. And then one day they started running. That's natural. The body, the mechanism, if you're a human being, you can walk. Is the design, right? And it's a material analogy, so there are exceptions, but like humans are meant to walk, birds are meant to fly. The soul is meant to connect with the Supreme. That's how it's designed. That's what it is. And there are no faults in that design. There's no errors. So it's very encouraging because it's not that we're imposing something artificial, something external, some, cultural or, brainwashing manipulations like then you can think like this and then you're all of a sudden you're a devotee. Is like, no, it's actually a matter of uncovering that natural inclination to service, which is really what we're all about anyway. Thank you. Any other reflections on last week?
I mean, I wasn't here last week, but what you just said, I like vibrate with that, like really hot, like I resonate with that a lot. I mean, because it's like when you feel that your soul is a part of something bigger, you innately feel that rasa, and like I feel like that's how you know, like you're feeling the kind of supreme, that you're not the body, that you're like connected to a bigger body as a whole, kind of like going back to that point of devotional happiness is like giving for the sake of just giving, because you know that, okay, I'm not just this individual capsule, I'm a part of a whole. And like I feel that's how, at least I'm able to kind of like see that and like interpret that. So I thought
Yeah,
that was really,
it's very relatable. Actually, even materially, everyone is hankering for that kind of experience. This is
yeah.
why we identify with families. There's a certain security in that. This is why we identify with a country. Actually, this is why we go to concerts and movie theaters. We want to have a
Mhm.
transcendent experience beyond the tiny little box of our own ego. We want to get
Mhm.
out of that and have something beyond. And so those are all material indications of our own desire to get out of our own little box. And that's there
Mhm.
because we're actually meant to connect to not just something a little greater materially, but the greatest, that
The
which is
greatest,
connected
yep.
to everyone and everything. And that's the actual capacity of the soul. So thank you for speaking to that. Yeah. Any other reflections from last week? Anything that you heard? Anything in the WhatsApp?
Yeah, Shamya Pras, it's sort of piggybacking off of what many of you just said, but to say it very succinctly is that bhakti is not learned, it's uncovered. And that all of the rules and regulations and practices offered to us through sadhana and such and um are to get us to a place to always remember Krishna and never forget him. And how we can pose the question to ourselves however often we can remember to, right? Of how can I remember Krishna right now? And what can I do to remember Krishna right now? Or what can I do to not forget him? And
Right.
even that in itself is such like a powerful guardrail, because there's so many things that are not conducive to our spiritual growth and advancement, or even just to our lasting or I guess happiness is not lasting, but just there are so many things that are to our detriment that we think um are going to bring us to happiness, right? And they are actually things that when we do it we are forgetting Krishna. So that question of like, what can I do right now to not forget Krishna, I think is actually very, very helpful.
Yeah, that's like the root. That's the base level analysis of life. It's beyond all the, legalities of technicalities of religion and or you can call it dharma or codes of conduct or etiquette or, right and wrong, morality. It's ultimately that which is helpful for us, that which is good, that which is auspicious, beneficial, moral, ethical, ultimately helps us to remember and stay connected with our remembrance of and to not forget our ultimate relationship with the Supreme. And if you trace it back, anything that's the opposite, it endangers that. It creates forgetfulness. It clouds the heart. It gets in the way of that pure, soft-hearted, natural, humble connection. And so that's the root cause. That's why things are good or bad ultimately. In the bhakti point of view, there's some material, there are legal considerations and material considerations. As long as you're in the world, you have to function with that. But in the grand scheme of things, that's the root. So just to make it easier to understand moment to moment how we should make decisions as devotees. Yeah, very organic consideration. Thank you. All right. So moving into chapter 4. Chapter 4 is called Devotional Service Surpasses All Liberation. So in this section, it's actually really beautiful because this entire chapter is just it consists of a series of quotes and references from scripture, and they're all substantiating this point. So that's, first of all, the point is that when we're trying to make a point, we don't just say, I think it's like this, I think it's like that. Rupa Goswami, he actually establishes this point very systematically by quoting from Srimad Bhagavatam, quoting from the Narada Pancharatra, other texts saying, as this devotee said, or as this time in this verse in this chapter, et cetera, et cetera. And so we can see that that's the way to actually establish something. Just like in science, you don't, write a paper and say, I think it's like this. Well, you can quote your previous acharyas. What did the previous scientists discover? How have I replicated that study? There's a certain burden of proof you have to actually demonstrate. So here we see Rupa Goswami's consideration of scripture, what has actually been said. And he dedicates an entire chapter to this, to show that simply getting liberated from the body is not the total gift of bhakti. So a little bit of context here. In Orthodox culture, in the Vedic tradition, this tradition, there is a way in which one is encouraged to kind of gradually come to the point of realizing they're not their body. And this is a multi-lifetime thing, that one in this lifetime as a human being has certain inclinations. They operate in this way or that way. So they may be like, working the land, in which case they'd be called a Vaishya, or they're managing people and they're a Kshatriya, or maybe they're into arts and crafts, they're a Shudra, or they're a Brahmana. And as one becomes refined and dedicates himself in whatever their particular material dharma is in the lifetime, gradually, they come to the Brahminical stage. They become more and more renounced. They gradually realize, they study scripture and so forth. They become more in the mode of goodness. They realize that they're actually not their body. And they become qualified to truly realize that, understand, not just intellectually, but function, that they're not their body, they're beyond that. And in this way, the intellectual class is very much appreciated, is very glorified in scripture, that these are what is that term in English? Like philosopher kings. The ancient Greeks had the idea of enlightened, renounced, wise people to guide a society, philosopher kings, right? So this is what the Brahminical culture is glorified as. And Orthodox culture is very much like, know your place and function within it, and eventually, gradually come to a higher stage. And they make a great deal, of the point of liberation, what's called mukti. Mukti is described in scripture. It's even described in Bhagavad Gita. Mukti literally means to be released from, to be freed from, right? So the actual science of what mukti is described in this chapter. There are 5 different kinds of mukti. Generally, when we hear about mukti, we're hearing about the last kind, what's called in Sanskrit is sayujya. Sayujya means to be liberated from all material conceptions and to actually merge into the existence of the Lord, which means a loss of personal identity and release from the material platform. So for traditionalists and followers of Orthodox culture who are very interested in the idea of mukti, that's generally what they understood it as. And you can think of it like it's liberation from, right? That whole idea is like, well, the world has all this hypocrisy. I'm actually an eternal being, but I'm bound by all these temporal things. I actually don't belong to all these things, but I'm connected to all of them. So liberation means liberation from what? From the body, from family considerations, from birth and death, from the seasons, from the coming and going, from age, from disease, all these things, which is actually true. That's part of what liberation is. But that focus of liberation from actually doesn't really deal with liberation to. So then what is there positively at the liberated platform? The other 4 kinds of liberation, actually, they talk about this. So with reference to, I think, mainly the 3rd canto of Srimad Bhagavatam, this chapter indicates what those other kinds of liberation are. For example, there is sadrupya, to have a form, a spiritual form that is similar to the Lord's. Salokya, to reside on a spiritual loka, planet, to reside in proximity to the Lord. Samipya, to be very closely residing close to the Lord. And sarshti, to have the same spiritual opulences as the Lord. So these are all kinds of liberation. And of those 5, devotees will accept any of the last 4, but they will not accept sayujya, because sayujya means there's no more service. There's no more personal realization. There's no more doing anything for the Supreme. There's no more acts of love. and reception of love, because there's the eradication of one's individuality. So bhakti actually isn't just about becoming freed from all those things, the material platform. It's liberation too. Liberation to actually freely exchange love, to freely connect with and understand and experience the presence of the divine beloved. And that's what devotees are aspiring for. So in this way, bhakti is actually revolutionary. It's actually revolutionary to Orthodox culture, because the very stratified, very kind of like materially rigid system of Indian Varnashram and Indian Orthodox culture and spiritual culture was really looking at liberation from the material body as the end goal. And therefore, the Brahminical caste is the highest caste. And this caste system is like is etched in stone. Wherever your position is, that's what you have to function as. And the end goal of life is just to become free from the body, free from the cycle of birth and death, free from samsara, free from rebirth, right? But Bhakti is saying, no, that's just where it begins, actually. Because once you're truly liberated from that, then you can actually have no more distraction to truly, freely exchange service and love with the Supreme Person. And in this way, actually, as Srila Prabhupada points out, there's a way in which in traditional circles, this message was not very well received because it's quite revolutionary. It actually becomes a little bit revolutionary in terms of the social structure, because then everybody is eligible for the highest gift, and it's no longer just the property of the intellectual and spiritual elite. Well, we have a responsibility to share what Scripture and the previous teachers have said. That is actually the fact. It is not the sole property of the intellectual or spiritual elite. It's the birthright of every living entity, especially one who's in a human form of life can actually aspire for bhakti as the supreme goal. And so Srila Prabhupada writes, the impersonalists desire to merge into the existence of the Supreme, but without keeping their individuality, they have no chance of hearing and chanting the glories of the Supreme Lord. Because they have no idea of the transcendental form of the Lord, there is no chance of their chanting and hearing of his transcendental activities. In other words, unless one is already beyond liberation, one cannot relish the transcendental glories of the Lord, nor can one understand the transcendental form of the Lord. On the material platform, it's very easy to misunderstand and consider. There are just certain ideas like, oh, well, even if the Supreme Person has a form, it's a temporary form. It's just something that, they're actually beyond that. There's actually just the big oneness beyond all that. That's not what Bhagavad Gita says. That's not what the scriptures actually say. So these are concoctions from the material platform. So in this way, this chapter systematically, through many, many references, indicates that the devotee is actually not primarily interested in just being liberated. They're actually interested in service. And the best way to understand that is by reference to those who have actually transcended from the material platform to the bhakti platform. One example of that, among many, it's actually there in the Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 4, is of the four Kumaras. The four Kumaras were actually very early sons of Brahma, the original progenitor, first kind of created living entity of Krishna. And in every lifetime of Brahma, the lifetime of Brahma is basically the lifetime of a universe, and he's the first living entity. From him, all these other generations come who organize the management of the universe and so forth. But one of the first children of his were the four Kumaras. Four actually, they take the form of young boys. It's described, they took this form of young, like kind of almost just toddlers. And they chose to remain in that form because they wanted to have nothing to do with the world. They chose, we don't want to actually get involved in this whole thing. Brahma was actually a little bit peeved about this. He wanted people to help administer. He needed managers. And they're like, no, we're just going to be like kids. We're going to stay in this Peter Pan world of, we're not going to have, kids of our own. We're not going to get into all the ins and outs of material life. We're just going to philosophize and realize our non-material entity, our non-material identity, right? That's what we're all about. And they're actually quite empowered in terms of transcendental, like, impersonal spiritual knowledge. Now, at one point, from that platform of being liberated, actually, they're actually materially liberated, but they're not devotees yet. They, in a pastime that's elaborately described in the fourth canto, they visited Vaikuntha, the spiritual planets, and on the outskirts of that, they had interaction with the gatekeepers of the spiritual world. And long story short, they actually became attracted to the form of the Lord. They actually experienced him through their own senses. They could smell, it's described, the smell of the tulsi buds that were offered at his lotus feet. They actually began to experience spiritual sense objects, and their hearts became more and more attracted. And it's described that they became attracted to the bhakti process, and they actually became founder acharyas of their own bhakti lineage. The four Kumaras are actually founders of bhakti lineage because they became great devotees. And so when we have the testimony of persons who are either they come from the material platform, or like the Kumaras, they come from the impersonally liberated platform, and they're like, no, actually bhakti is greater, then we can actually understand by comparison. Because for ourselves, we think, well, I guess greater than what I have is like, an iPhone 15, and maybe like I could live for 200 years. And how about I don't need like, cane when I get old? That seems pretty good. That seems like the best that life can offer. It's like, no, just from our own context, we can't possibly understand what the capacity of the soul is. So rather, we have these references, and this chapter is full of all these references, descriptions about the devotees, what they have to say. So Vritrasura, Canto 6, he says, my dear Lord, by leaving your transcendental service, I may be promoted to the planet called Dhruvaloka, the pole star, or I may gain lordship over all the planetary systems of the universe, but I do not aspire to this. Nor do I wish the mystic perfections of yoga practice, nor do I aspire to spiritual emancipation. All I wish for, my Lord, is your association and transcendental service eternally. So he's talking about different categories of experiences, some karmic benefits, and what's called yoga siddhi. There's an elaborate description in the 11th canto of tertiary, secondary, and primary yogic siddhis, yogic perfections. The highest forms of these are like really the capacity to obtain any material object one wants, to control the mind of anyone else, to create and destroy entire planets at will. And we're talking about like levels of, Jedi magic tricks that we're not even capable of in this age is described. In this age, only the tertiary ones are really accessible. They're like, low grade extension of life and low grade mental powers and so forth. And so these are also available to the living entity. And the devotee is like, nope, not interested in that. Not interested in lordship or overlordship or any kind of, longer life or wealth or whatever in this world. I just want what I have. I want this bhakti. I want it to grow. I want more service to you. I want connection to you. I want to actually be in this bhakti relationship. So there's essentially quote after quote after quote of this. And I really recommend looking at this chapter through a lens of like what these different devotees and different scriptures are indicating about the realization of people who have actually come to the platform of truly realizing what bhakti really is. So give another example. In the Hayashusha Pancharatra, it is stated, my dear Lord, O Supreme Personality of Godhead, I do not want any resultant benediction from my religious life, nor do I want any economic development, nor do I want to enjoy sense gratification, nor liberation. I simply pray to be an eternal servant at your lotus feet. So this is referring to the 5 different kinds of what's called purusharthas, human goals of a living entity. Pancha purushartha, 5 different goals. There's kama, in Sanskrit, Kama, to gratify the senses, right? To feel something through one's senses, the connection of the senses with the sense objects. That's one of the goals of life. That's something you can have. There's also artha, material development, right? Generally, artha leads to kama. As you have become materially developed, you have some wealth, you have some resources, then you can actually gratify your senses. There's dharma. In this context, dharma means like religiousness, the capacity to be like righteous and follow the moral path. Actually, dharma creates artha. By being a moral person, one creates and attracts wealth. By functioning morally, one actually gets good karma. Then one can gratify their senses. The 4th is mukti, to be freed of that whole cycle. And the 5th is actually prema. As devotees, we're not actually aiming at any of those other 4 things. They're part of life. Even mukti, even liberation is part of the life of a devotee. It comes. Liberation from the body, liberation from illusion. but we're actually not aiming for it. We're aiming for prema, pure love of God. That's the ultimate goal. So it's really important. Rupa Goswami, dedicating a whole chapter to this, really wants us to understand how important it is to not misidentify bhakti as a material thing, simply like a materially advantageous position. Sometimes in those same circles, like the very orthodox culture that was very glorifying of mukti, bhakti was considered a lower thing. It was considered like, oh, bhakti is for the sentimentalists. Bhakti is for those who are still, they're kind of attached to their feelings. And actually, we're really about getting beyond that. But as long as you're there, you can engage your feelings temporarily in this bhakti thing. And that's good. That's a misunderstanding. That's very much a misunderstanding. Bhakti is actually not a sentimental thing. Bhakti is a function of the soul. And as one develops in bhakti, the resultant spiritual development actually eclipses what one can have simply by renunciation or intellectual capacity to realize they're not their body, right? So we'll pause there. We'll take any comments, questions, and reflections. We talked about the example of the four Kumaras as persons who were already liberated. They're at the level of impersonal liberation. We talked about the 5 kinds of liberation: sayujya, to be released from all personal identity and actually just merge into the existence of the Supreme. And the 4 kinds of personal liberation: spiritual form, spiritual location, spiritual proximity, and spiritual wealth, spiritual opulences of the Lord. And all those last 4 are conducive to service. You can accept them. Devotees can accept them because they don't get in the way of service, but they won't accept to merge, to give away their identity. They won't accept a loss of service, a loss of connection. We talked about how Rupa Goswami and Srila Prabhupada are so insistent to help us understand that bhakti is beyond mukti. It's beyond liberation. It's beyond all of these other gifts that one can achieve: the kama, the sense gratification; the artha, economic development; the dharma, religiosity, uprightness, morality; and the mukti, actually, the liberation, freedom from all these things. Prema, Krishna prema, goal of bhakti, is actually beyond all of those things. And the devotee ultimately, as the 3rd canto Srimad Bhagavatam indicates, they will not accept any form of liberation unless it's supportive of their service, right? Like a devotee may think, I would like to be with Krishna in the spiritual world, but a pure devotional sentiment is not just like, well, I want to be free from this crazy world of nonsense, I want to go there. It's actually the pure, rarefied, refined part of that desire as well, there with a spiritual body. Then I don't have to go to sleep, wake up and deal with my morning breath and my clouded mind and the fact that I'm living in this aging vehicle. I can actually serve with a spiritual body without cessation. I don't have to have all the problems, or I can, does that make sense? That's actually the ones that the root of one's desire to exist in a spiritual proximity to the Lord. But because of this last one I'll take before reflections, because of this transcendental nature of bhakti, the pure devotee who has no other desire is actually indifferent to whether they live in a hellish or a heavenly situation. In fact, 6th canto Bhagavatam directly says this. Lord Shiva says, Narayana parasarve na kutashchana bipiti svarga pavarsha narakeshva pitilyartha darshanaha. That for the pure devotee, heavenly or hellish situations are the same, because they're both temporary. There's no such thing as eternal damnation, and there's no such thing as eternal heaven in the material planets. There's just better karma and worse karma, right? So somebody who's in the pure devotional platform, they're not sitting around thinking like, well, I really hope my back doesn't hurt today. They're not worried about the comings and goings of karma and comfort. They're actually indifferent to that. It's like, okay, am I in jail? Okay, I'll chant Hare Krishna there. I'll help people in that context to connect, because bhakti is available there. Am I in the heavenly planets, also known as Hawaii? There are higher planets, but we can also taste a little bit of that even on this planet. Great, okay, fine. I'm not attached to it. As long as I'm there, cool. But I'm not there to just chill on the beach. I'm there to practice my bhakti. I'm there to actually do the same thing I would in the prison or anywhere else. Bhakti is beyond all of that. So now we'll take any comments, questions, reflections on how bhakti surpasses all kinds of liberation. Anything you heard that stuck out before we go to chapter 5.
I like how you described, liberation would be acceptable as long as the devotee can still be in the spirit of devotion
Right.
in the presence of Krishna. That made a lot of sense because I was fascinated by the concept of it. And I was, as I was reading, because I did read ahead, the way that you put that just made a lot of sense because it's not like I just want to be liberated from this because I'm tired of all these lives, or I just want to go lay on the beach next to Krishna because it's pretty cool there. Like,
Right.
not for personal gain, to be able to continue to be in the service of that makes a lot of sense. Thank
Yeah.
you.
We're not aiming for liberation. We're not averse to it. We're not aiming for a better situation materially. We're not averse to it. Those things can come and go. That's the pure devotional platform. Before we're there, we may be like, I'd really like to practice bhakti, but I'd also like to be free from disease. I'd like to practice bhakti, but I'd like, the country I'm in to be less crazy. Or I'd like, one might have like some mixed motivation. That's okay. One can keep practicing, but the capacity of the soul is to be truly invested only in that bhakti goal. And as one develops, one comes closer and closer to that. Yeah.
That makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. More reflections or questions?
Mine will be real short. It's interesting after studying the Gita as much as we have with you, and part of the major lesson is like detachment, like not being attached to the results of our activities. And this
Right.
is like taking that to a completely other level. And like, not only as you practice your dharma, do you not need to be attached to the results of, what you do, but like spiritually, you got to be completely detached from the results and just focus on the main thing. So it's like elevating that message even higher, within this
Yeah.
time.
We're not just becoming detached from material benefits, we're being detached from spiritual benefit. And ultimately, this is kind of prescriptive, like we're meant to try to aim for that, but it's also descriptive because by tasting bhakti, one naturally becomes indifferent to the lower things. It's not that we're supposed to be like, oh, I'm bad. I'm a bad person because I want these lower things. I want to be free from suffering, or I want to see, this result for my family or my kids. It's like I have to change that about myself. Not really. It's actually inspirational for practice of bhakti because bhakti is so wonderful and so universal and so unconditional and so always accessible that when one is truly experiencing it, one naturally doesn't want those other things. They don't measure up, right? That's the experience of a devotee on that platform. So the way to really realize that is by experiencing it. This is all ultimately meant to be inspirational for practicing bhakti, not, yeah, you're not good enough, so don't even try. You don't belong here. We're going to gatekeep you from real bhakti. This is real bhakti. You're over there doing mixed bhakti. It's like, no, this is the point. It's like, this is how beautiful it can be. This is how great it really is, And we can taste that when we chant, like, even one mantra, even one round, just a few seconds of truly concentrated, dedicated japa. We know our heart is really in it. Then we're like, wow, that was really different than all the other mantras I chanted, where I was kind of like a pinball bouncing around between fear and anxiety and all the other things. That one was really present. We can feel that, and we get a taste of what these verses are telling us, what this philosophy is indicating to us. Like, wow, I can actually have that all the time. Okay. Thank you. Any other reflections or questions or comments before we go to chapter 5? All right. Chapter 5. Drum roll. This internet connection is being slow. There we go. Chapter 5, the purity of devotional service. So in this chapter, we're going to hear about how bhakti is actually beyond all material considerations and what that means for us. So Srila Prabhupada writes, and I'll just share the screen for this part. Okay. All the previous instructions imparted by Rupa Goswami in his broad statements can be summarized thus. As long as one is materially inclined or desirous of merging into the spiritual effulgence, one cannot enter into the realm of pure devotional service. Next, Rupa Goswami states that devotional service is transcendental to all material considerations, and that is not limited to any particular country, class, society, or circumstance. As stated in Srimad Bhagavatam, devotional service is transcendental and has no cause, right? Meaning no material cause. There's no material thing that creates it. It is transcendental to all material causes and effect. Devotional service is executed without any hope for gain, and it cannot be checked by any material circumstances. It is open for all without any distinction, and it is the constitutional occupation of the living entities. This is actually very important. This is a very deep thing. So again, a whole chapter is dedicated to this. In the Srimad Bhagavatam early on, there's a verse 126. Savai pungsam paro dharmo yato bhakti ratokshaje. Ahai tukya pratihita yayatma suprasidati. Let's see what the translation is exactly so I don't have to speculate it. It's a beautiful verse. It's almost like the thesis statement for why the Bhagavatam exists. It's stating this. The supreme occupation for all humanity is that by which someone can attain to loving devotional service unto the transcendent Lord. Such devotional service must be unmotivated and uninterrupted to completely satisfy the self, right? That thing that really satisfies the self completely is pure service to the Supreme, which is unmotivated, meaning it's not for any other purpose. One is not doing it to get some other thing back, and it is not interrupted. It is not on again and off again. It is steady. So this uninterrupted and unmotivated devotional service is what Srila Prabhupada is referring to here when he says, it is executed without any hope for gain, and it cannot be checked by any material circumstances. He's referring actually to that verse, 126 Bhagavatam. And he says it is open for all without any distinction, and it is the constitutional occupation of the living entities. So this chapter begins with a description of a bit of history. And this is history of Indian spirituality, but it's also, in a broader sense, it's generally history of humanity, because this is not just this kind of pattern is not just something that happened in India or happened in that place. It is constantly happening. There is always a way in which the pure message that bhakti is open for all without any distinction. It is the constitutional occupation of the living entities, of all living entities. As Prabhupada says, not limited to any particular country, class, society, or circumstance, becomes limited to country, class, society, or circumstance, right? So Srila Prabhupada talks about how in the generations after Lord Chaitanya's presence on the planet in bodily form with his associates like Nityananda and others, many persons who were actually related to their line. For example, Lord Nityananda himself had children. And so there are people on the planet who are related by blood to him. And so Srila Prabhupada talks about a class of priestly persons claim to be descendants of Nityananda, calling themselves the Goswami caste. They further claim that the practice and spreading of devotional service belonged only to their particular class, which is known as Nityananda Vangsha. In this way, they exercised their artificial power for some time. Until Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, Srila Prabhupada's spiritual teacher, completely smashed that idea. There was a great hard struggle for some time, but it has turned out successfully, and is now correctly and practically established that devotional service is not restricted to a particular class of person. So, can anybody think this is like a no-brainer? Easy pickings. Can anybody think of any way in which there's discrimination on some basis, that something is actually the property only of this category? Give me some way in which that happens, right? some discrimination. I'll start us off. Ethnically. Give us another one.
I was race, gender.
Race, gender, age, sexuality, class,
Ableism.
ableism, cisgender, transgender, skin color, language, accent, height, weight, you name it, right? This is the function of the material platform. There are material distinctions. True equality does not exist on the material platform. True equality exists on the spiritual platform, which is why everybody's hankering for it, because we're made for it. There are no two people who are exactly the same height. There are no, if you have a precise enough measuring tool, you'll find somebody is just ever so slightly shorter than the other person. There are no two people that are exactly the same age, exactly the same skin tone, exactly the same anything. It's all diversity, material diversity. But every living entity has spiritual equality. They're all spiritually equally valuable, right? So when you have this junction between the material distinction and the spiritual non-distinction, then things get muddy. Whereas the living entity is always, especially in the human form of life, when we can intentionally practice, they have the capacity to practice bhakti. It is open for all without distinction. There are distinctions on the material platform. So when there are systems based around those distinctions, then you start to get the message that actually the ultimate goal is not for everybody. First, you have to become one of the chosen people, whatever that happens to be at any given time, whether it's male, wealthy, this skin color, that doesn't matter. It's just some overclass, some underclass. But again, we're having the point hammered down, just so there's no doubt. Bhakti is for everybody. It is the religion of the soul. It is not the religion of Indian people. It is not the religion of Brahmanas. It is not the religion of Sanskrit speakers. It is not the religion of men or women. It is the religion of the soul, right? At the level of the soul, there are no Christians or Muslims or Hare Krishnas or, Gaudiya Vaishnavas. There are only lovers of God. That's the religion of the soul. That is everybody's right. That's who we are. And so that non-sectarian consideration is so important, because the material platform is the platform of sectarianism. That's the material platform. That's where sectarianism lives, because we have to draw material distinctions to function in this world. If I want the peanut butter jar from the top shelf, I call my tall friend, not my short friend. That's a material consideration. If I'm a spiritually oriented person, I don't love my tall friend more. I just know they're suited for that material task. So over and over and over again, generation after generation, there has to be this renewal of this truth, because otherwise it becomes gradually dissipated. The beginning of the fourth chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Krishna said, I shared this science with the son of the sun god, Vivasvan, and gradually in time it became disrupted. Therefore, I'm sharing it again with you. It's an eternal science. Sakalini hayugo mahata nashtaf parantapa. I'm sharing with you this great science that's eternally true because it appears to have become disrupted. I'm renewing it again. It's always true, but people always have to be reminded. This is not function of, the chosen people. There are no chosen people. We have a hand from Eileen. Yes, go ahead.
So this is a question that I've been struggling with for probably a couple of years now, and it kind of is brought out again, which is, Krishna's made, we're all the same, right? We're all spirit souls that are all part of the divine, but he's made us all so different. Like some people have musical talent, some people have artistic talent, some people have number talent, some people are really, studious, some people are more creative. He's created so much difference. Why? And is it Maya to make it, is this part of Maya's job, how we uncover all these special things? I just never understood why Krishna gives each of us all different gifts, and we're all so different if we're all still the same. And what's that purpose? What was his purpose in doing that?
Well, first of all, we have to take a look at our own agency in that. We're in the material world because we want to be. Nobody put us here against our will. The reason there's material distinction is traceable to our previous activities. You're talking about karma, right? Why did Mozart compose symphonies and have the capacity to do so? And beyond capacity, practically he was addicted to it. It just sprung up in his head, unbidden. He had to create music. By the age of 4, he was doing things that in my whole life I could never do, musically. Why? I don't know what his karma is, but clearly he had some karmic credit musically, you know? Jimi Hendrix had some karmic credit musically. We all have some, currency that way. These are all karmic considerations. So if you trace out the history of living entity beyond this particular body and manifestation, we can see what karma is to some degree. But so I would reframe the question. It's not like Krishna is creating it. Krishna is facilitating it. But the wanderings and exploring of the living entities, countless of them, life after life, is self-directed. It's intentional, right? It's a function of the living entity's free will combined with the opportunities brought to it by material nature, Maya, as you call it. So it's also a reflection of spiritual reality. It's not spiritual reality, but it's a reflection of it. How? Because spiritual reality is unity in diversity. In spiritual reality, living entities are not just homogeneously exactly the same. They're constitutionally the same, but they also have their own unique flavor, their own variety of how they connect with Krishna. For example, one objection or consider a concern around practicing spiritual life is, well, I don't want to be like a zombie. I don't want to be like everyone else. I want to really be my own true individual, unique self. And I feel like if I practice in this movement or that movement or this religion or this thing, or if I chant that mantra or do this prayer, it's all just like, it's all just kind of creating artificial oneness. My experience, on the other hand, that's a very natural fear, right? I think we all have that in some way or shape or form. But to speak to that, like my experience of the most advanced devotees I know is that they are the most unique individuals I know. Full stop. Among any people I know. They're so different from each other while still being on the same platform of purity of intention, right? Some are very, very soft and gentle. Some are fiery and fierce and cutting. But in all cases, they're pure and they're for the pleasure of Krishna. Some are dedicated to the earth and cows and that kind of life. And some are very intellectual and their services in that realm. And some have this personality and some have that personality. But that all manifests over time as they develop in bhakti, right? There's unity in purpose. They're all on that spiritual platform, but they're very, very diverse. So we see a reflection of that here. In this material realm, no two living beings are the same, right? Materially, they're always different. In fact, if you really pin it down, our own bodies aren't the same second to second. They're shifting so fast biologically. And beyond that, there's like subatomically, like it's just mind-blowing how fast things are moving. They're always shifting. That's a reflection of spiritual reality. But spiritual reality is nothing's being created, nothing's being destroyed. Everything is pure, consistent. And that variety, that personality is eternal and pure and devoid of inebriety, devoid of problem, right? Devoid of illness. So ultimately, I guess the answer to your question is it's an indication. The material world is an indication of what's possible. It's an indication of spiritual variety. But it's also a reflection of countless living entities over countless lives directing their own free will in haphazard ways, right? So basically what this chapter of the Nectar of Devotion is helping us to disambiguate, differentiate between the material platform and the spiritual platform. We don't reject the material platform. We still have to function within it. We have our roles in society. They have a purpose. But it remains true that bhakti is for everybody. It remains true that it is open for all without distinction. It remains true that spiritual development is the right of any living entity, regardless of their material position. At least human beings. So human beings have a certain privilege that we'll admit, we're more privileged than the rabbit-bodied beings or the, lizard-bodied beings. We're not spiritually better than them, but we're materially more privileged. At least all human beings have the capacity to really aim for bhakti without distinction. Make sense? So to that end, there's a nice verse in the 7th canto of Srimad Bhagavatam where Narada Muni says, Yasya yallakshanam proktam pungsa varnabhivyanjakam yad anyatrapi drushyeta tat teinaiva vinirjishyati, which means that when you see somebody has a certain quality, you should judge them on that quality, not on the position they're occupying. In other words, the essence of somebody's position is their qualification for it, right? The position doesn't create your qualification creates your position. Sometimes people think like, well, because of my parents, because of where I am in the world, I'm owed this of a certain like Yumi or someone else has a certain like what's the word? When you feel you're owed something.
Entitlement?
Entitlement. Yeah, thank you. And it's not like that. There is upward and downward mobility. It's not that because somebody's just like if somebody's parents are doctors, that doesn't mean that they're qualified to be a doctor. They may have a genetic predisposition if both their parents are doctors, or maybe some way in which they have a certain intelligence or studiousness, or even maybe their upbringing helps them, but they still have to go to school for it. No one's going to accept like, yeah, well, my dad's a doctor and so is his dad and his dad. So I'm going to cut you up, cut you open. I'm going to heal you. Like, no, So similarly, one's qualification as a devotee, there are actual measurable qualities around this. We've talked about this in various texts, like Nectar of Instruction talked about it extensively. Nectar of Devotion, this book is going to get into it more as well. That we can see what different grades of devotees are by their qualifications. So what that means is somebody's material standing doesn't actually have any bearing necessarily on their spiritual standing, right? Somebody can be materially very degraded, but spiritually very enlightened, very aware. Somebody can be materially very, very advanced and be a spiritual child, a spiritual infant, very ignorant of basic spiritual truth, just by being wealthy or beautiful or coming from a good family. And so, as you can probably sense, this is a rather revolutionary idea for an entire planet or entire universe full of people who are stuck on the material platform. This is quite a revolutionary idea. Lord Chaitanya's followers shared bhakti indiscriminately. They really shook up their very rigid, ossified caste system, varnashram system. They took the spiritual privilege out of the hands of brahmanas, and they said this is for everybody, and it is accessible to everybody. Srila Prabhupada himself made it his own personal responsibility to make Lord Chaitanya's wish come true. Lord Chaitanya said, in every town and village, Krishna's name should be chanted. The access should be there. Srila Prabhupada wasn't thinking like, well, I don't know how I'm going to do this, so I guess I'm not going to try. He was thinking, I don't know how this is going to happen, but he wants it, so I got to try, and it's going to happen somehow or other. So in this movement, we're basically operating on that principle. We're operating on the principle of somehow or other, this is what Krishna wants. So we're taking it to the South Pole. We're taking it to Burlington, Vermont. We're taking it everywhere and anywhere. And there is this way in which everybody can decide to plug in wherever they want, and they can make advancement at their own rate. And that's open to everybody. And kind of a corollary to all that is, whereas, in the material varnashram system, you have Shudras and Vaishyas and Kshatriyas and Brahmanas, people who have different castes or, different occupational duties. You may have that in a devotional community, like somebody may be very intellectual and giving class and reading books, like I'm doing like that, right? That's a so-called a Brahminical service on paper. That's what Brahmins are supposed to do. But but it's for Krishna. Someone else is like, taking care of Krishna's cows or farming for Krishna or running a business for Krishna. Someone else is an artist for Krishna, right? And they're not considered a Brahmana or a Shudra or whatever those occupational duties are. They're considered a devotee. Because the consideration is not actually, how materially auspicious or what mode of nature are they in? Because they're not participating in the modes of nature. If they're doing this as a service, they're not in the modes of nature anymore. You can clean toilets for Krishna. That's a very inauspicious material thing. But if you're doing it for Krishna, if you're doing it for his devotees, that is completely a liberated platform. That is beyond caste or creed. That is not a low system, a low place at all. That's a very high place. You can finish doing that and then give a class, and you haven't become elevated. If it's for Krishna, it's for Krishna. They're all on the same platform. Devotees don't really continue to identify with their material designation, and they're careful to view other devotees that way too. Oh, this is a Brahmin devotee because they give class. This is a Shudra devotee because they're just like a painter. No, 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 no. It's a function of the heart. It's a function of one's dedication to Krishna. What is the purity of that? Not the shape it takes materially, their service. Does that make sense? And the last point that comes up that I want to mention from this chapter is what's called prayaschitta, atonement. So in spiritual circles, there's this consideration of like, if you do something wrong, you take on some impurity. How do you get purified of that? Like, right? What is the atonement? What is the ritualistic process? So again, in our tradition and in all spiritual traditions, there's this consideration of atonement. There's like, you go and you confess, or you chant these mantras, whether it's a Hail Mary or you do these obeisances, you give in charity, you do some karmic pious activity, and that counteracts the impiety. You've made a mistake and you counteract it, right? That's called karma. And so that's the science of how to use good karma to counteract bad karma, right? But what Rupa Goswami is proving through his quotations here is that the highest form of atonement is bhakti itself. If one is actually contaminated by present impious activities or previous impious activities, there is no karmic rectification. There is no like giving away in charity or fasting or self-abnegation or transcendental knowledge even that is more purifying than the sincere and humble prosecution of bhakti practice. That in and of itself is the most practical, efficacious way to cleanse the heart. Because really what you want to do when we're talking about atonement is not just how to counteract the negative results of what you've done, but how to purify the heart so you don't even want to do that which distracts you from Krishna anymore. You don't want to do that which is not in your best interests. That's the real challenge. It's not such a big deal to make amends. That's good. That's civilized people make amends. But better than making amends, and just like an elephant, once they get out of the water, splashing mud all over themselves again, better than making amends and going back and doing the same mistake is to be freed of that desire, those desires that are actually useless and degrading. That purification of the heart is most practically effected through the bhakti process. So bhakti itself is the highest form of atonement. It's the highest form of self-purification. Does that make sense? Not talking about judgment or punishment, talking about rectification, purification, right? Bhakti is actually the best way. No, this doesn't mean that somebody who's practicing bhakti, therefore, doesn't have any social or legal obligation. They may, right? There's a way in which we still have an obligation. It's like, I can't say to a court of law, even a court populated by devotee judges, I can't say to them, well, actually, I know I killed that person, but hey, I'm practicing bhakti, so I'm cool, right? We're good. It's like, no, you still function in that system. There may be a way in which there's consequences. Nevertheless, for my internal purification, going to jail, although it may be necessary, will do less for me than the sincere practice of bhakti. I may have to go to jail and practice bhakti there. That may be the case. But for the self-purification, the bhakti process is the greatest path. It's actually the most indicated process, greater than any karmic adjustment. Make sense? And that should be very encouraging, because it means that, thank you, Samantha, and I have to run, Hare Krishna. It means that even if we're practicing bhakti imperfectly, then the practice itself is also qualifying us for the real goal, because it's actually helping us to practice more and more purely, without other consideration, without other motive. It's helping us to become free from those things that are holding us back from deeper practice. There's no other thing that we have to take into our bhakti practice to make it better, to like be better, good karma. You know, it's like, yeah, I really want to become a pure devotee, so I have to like worship the demigods. I really want to become a pure devotee of Krishna, practice pure bhakti, so I'm going to do volunteer service for Doctors Without Borders. I mean, you can do that. There's nothing wrong with it. Just don't think that's actually more purifying than practicing pure bhakti. The practice itself will purify you faster than any karmic adjustments can. So now we'll take any comments or questions or reflections on anything we said, chapter 4, anything that stood out, anything that you heard. I'd love to hear at least a couple just, I heard one sentence reflections or questions. Om Tat Sat. Hare Krishna.
I just have a question about, what you just said of like, even if you're going Doctors of Borders, I think you said.
Right.
I don't think that sort of relieves you from practicing bhakti. But what if you're doing that in your service? Like that's your seva, like that's what Krishna wants you to do. Isn't that then that you are in your bhakti?
Yeah, so then it's like Arjuna in the Bhagavad Gita. Apparently he's a general. Apparently he's a man of arms. Apparently he's a police officer type, protector type, but he's not. He's a devotee because his intention is service to Krishna. He begins by functioning as his occupation. Therefore, he's like, oh, I can't do this. This looks so bad. And he realizes, not only can I really want to. I'm so glad I'm aligned with Krishna's desire here, and I can use what I have in his service. And internally, that shift was made. It clicked for him. And so his experience goes from complete lamentation, illusion, misery to I'm calm, I'm happy, I'm good to go. And I'm absolutely ready to do this as a service for you. And he does. So yes, that's an example. And that's like the most intense example, going to war. So certainly being a doctor for Krishna is absolutely possible. You give the results of what you're doing back in service, and you serve people in that mode, and you practice your direct practices of bhakti at the same time. Absolutely. But for that person, they're not thinking that the technicalities of what I'm doing is actually purifying me. It's the service mentality. Like maybe you're a doctor and then you lose the function of your right hand, and you can't be like a surgeon anymore. You have to go and you have to teach how to be a doctor, teach doctor in medical science. It's like the nature of your service changes because everything is changing materially. But what can't be taken away is your bhakti, your intentionality, your service attitude. And that's what's really purifying the heart, not the incisions you're making and the suturing you're doing. That's not what's making the difference, right? It's not the technique, it's not the external, it's the internal. So yeah, quite right. More reflections, comments, or questions? What stood out? What did you hear? We have 8 people online. I want to hear at least 2 reflections from
Bhakti is for everybody. It's the
Bhakti
religion of the
is
soul.
Bhakti is for everybody. 4 words. Bhakti is for everybody. That's a sutra. It really is. It's a religion of the soul. Yeah, remember.
I sort of wonder what it would be like to, be like, what would it be like if we could all get to that place of God is for everyone, like that this is just because I'm so immersed in teaching a class about cultural ethnicity and diversity and the struggles that people have come. It really made like, what if that could be true? Like what kind of divide happens just in that thought to get there, right? Of what has to happen. So many things need to be dismantled in order to get to that place of everybody under one God, right? Under one belief system, under one knowing, right? That takes away a lot of people's, I'm going very deep here in my head of like, that takes a lot of power away from some people who have held on to their trajectory of whatever's happened to them, whether that's, I'll speak just from like you know, my experience of like a disabled dad, right? Like if you say everybody's the same and you're taking away maybe like what he didn't identify necessarily as a blind man, but he was, but other people identified. Do you know what I'm saying? Of like how, I just wonder what that would be like. You know, it makes me think of like the war that ensued, right? Is that with Arjuna? Like, is that what has to happen in order to all align and know? I mean, are we in that now? Sometimes it feels like it, but there's so many different battles going on. How do we bring people into like, it's just about God and being accepted, and that we can all live with this?
The short answer to your question of how we do that is by keeping Krishna in the middle. Rather than focusing on all the things that have to be dismantled, all the material detritus and things that are from a different mentality and are wholly or partially incorrect and are karmic and, you know, power systems and struggles, rather than trying to address those things individually on their own, what has to be changed is any given person's consciousness. And how it has to be changed is by coming closer and closer to Krishna. And so that means the practices of bhakti, which are non-sectarian. Meditation on Krishna's names, the Lord's names, hearing his pastimes, associating with his devotees. That creates a shift in the heart. Power systems are the sum total of people with material consciousness over long enough periods of time, and they're changed by other people with higher or lower consciousness. So we don't consider that like Einstein said, that the solution to a problem cannot be solved on the same platform on which it was created. We're not here to adjust those things. We're not fundamentally against, you know, addressing social inequities, for example. There's a certain amount of engagement in that, but the spiritual solution involves bringing people closer and giving them the opportunity to have access and letting them experience that and become purified by that, and then letting them make the difference, right? That critical mass of people individually making a difference for themselves to choose is really what does it. Otherwise, my experience is if we start to think about, it's not a bad thing to think about, but if we start to really kind of get into the nitty gritty of how is that going to happen, it's actually just, it's too much. You know, that Krishna actually has to do the heavy lifting of all that. What's on our plate, what our adhikar, our qualification may not be to solve the world's problems. Our qualification is like, okay, think globally, act locally. What does that mean? How do I take this into my life and make it accessible for those immediately around me? And what I see is when I'm in communities that are thriving because bhakti is very much alive and Krishna is in the center, you can really feel the functionality. Like when I was in Mayapur, beautiful devotional community in India. This is where Lord Chaitanya appeared 500 plus years ago. And there's a beautiful culture of internationally present devotees in Mayapur. And there's like fully intact systems of protecting cows and farming and, you know, waste management and water, and everything is very, very intentional, very in the mode of goodness, very much as a service and beautiful deity worship. And you have like all the Russian devotees like making beautiful Russian sourdough bread and selling in the market to the Asian devotees and like the Western devotees, and you experience a synergy and at a societal level that is amazing. Shows you what is possible, because we're talking about generations now and thousands of people at such a high level of practice for so long and so intensely that it's created like this social network. So I recommend experiencing that kind of thing to feel what's possible, because that's happened in the last 60 years, right? Or New Vrajadam in Hungary has happened in the last 40 years, but they're a remarkable example of a societally tight, powerful, unified community based on, you know, the same values, and it's like a few hundred people or something in Hungary outside of Budapest. And so, yeah, think globally, act locally, and find those little examples of functioning ecosystems that can help you to have faith and give you an example of what to work towards. They do exist, and they're amazing. They're really remarkable. Those are two that come to the top off the top of my head. Kishore Gopi mentioning that yesterday was the anniversary of the day that Srila Prabhupada arrived in New York City to start sharing bhakti with all of us. Yeah, Jai. Thank you, Srila Prabhupada. Otherwise, why would you ever leave Vrindavan to come to New York City, the Bowery, in the middle of the 60s with all the, I mean, he did it because he really had confidence that this is what Krishna wants. Turns out he was right. So we're grateful. Very, very grateful. Let's take at least one more reflection from anyone? Online person? Something that stood out. And then I'll give you your homework.
Bhakti is the highest atonement.
Bhakti is the highest atonement. Yeah. Thank you. All right, it's almost 8 o'clock. So, okay, so for this week, please, if you didn't already, read chapters 4 and 5. And for next week, we're gonna do 6 and 7. If you're feeling keen, if you're like Tanya and you want to read ahead, it's really cool because it'll give you a chance to get in touch with the ideas and start thinking about them before I start talking about them, and you'll take more away from the class. So you can read 6 and 7. What I'd like from this week in the WhatsApp chat, reflect back what you heard. When you heard, so specifically, when you heard that bhakti is independent of material things, right? That it's beyond material considerations, beyond caste or creed or culture. I want you to describe, what does that mean for you? How does that truth affect your life or practice, right? So, for example, you could say, I, Shamya Prastas, I'm really sitting with how I was living in the middle of Toronto, and because Srila Prabhupada left Vrindavan on the firm faith that bhakti is for everybody, I in Toronto, I was able to practice bhakti. That's what it means for me, right? You can say that. Something about, what does it mean that bhakti is independent of caste or creed or religion or age or gender? What does it mean that it's beyond the modes of nature, that everyone is entitled to it, that it's a religion of the soul? How does that personally affect you in your life? This is a personal reflection time. Share something about that. Does that make sense? Jai. All right. That's it. Srila Prabhupada ki jai. Srila Rupa Goswami ki jai. Nectar Devotion Group Bhakti House and Beyond ki jai. Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Thank you so much, everybody, for your attentive ears and hearts. And thanks for our online crew, our YouTube crew. We love you. And we'll see you in the ether. Hare Krishna and on WhatsApp.
Thank you, Sean, your breath.
Thank you, Drew. Great to see you.
See you too.
Thank you, Haribol. Good night, everybody.